on how your monitors are set up. Okay, so for those of you just joining, welcome again to the competency-based fieldwork evaluation orientation session. And thanks again for making time out of your day to come and spend time becoming familiar with this new evaluation as you prepare for Intermediate 1 students coming your way in May. I would also like to acknowledge Margaret Ann Campbell-Rempel, who recently retired in July, the previous academic fieldwork coordinator, who's really responsible for the development of most of the material in this workshop. So thank you to Margaret Ann. And for those of you just joining, please feel free to speak up and jump in with questions along the way, because it'll be a little hard for me to keep an eye on the chat or your hands as I'm sharing my screen. Before I get started, I would like to do a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Manitoba is located on Treaty 1 territory, on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. As a white settler woman, I do respect the treaties and the assumptions under which Indigenous peoples entered into these treaties. I acknowledge the harms done to Indigenous peoples who've cared for this land over the centuries, and I'm working to understand the history and ongoing impact of colonization and my role and responsibility in these harms. I acknowledge today that specifically as we talk about fieldwork within the OT program, this directly impacts Indigenous communities. And I'm committed to remaining humble and open and to engaging in meaningful collaboration with Indigenous communities in order for us to move forward in the best way possible together. I would like to, before we even fully get started, for those of you who don't know me, just to briefly introduce myself. So my name is Teresa Allison. I'm the acting academic fieldwork coordinator for the occupational therapy program. I work alongside closely with two other members of our fieldwork team who couldn't be here today, but the first one being Rhonda Van Vagel, who's our administrative coordinator of fieldwork, and Aya El-Alawi, who is our fieldwork outreach developer. So the three of us are a small but mighty team that if you haven't got a chance to know all of us already, we look forward to working with you and especially supporting you as you plan for and facilitate your students in Intermediate 1. So before we dive into the CBFE, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the MOT curriculum, just to help provide some context for where your students are at when they're coming to see you this May. So for some of you, this is a review, especially if you've been a student in our program. And for some of you, this is completely new information. So typically students in our 2-year program have 4 fieldwork placements that are stretched across the 2 years. Their first fieldwork placement is a 4-week basic placement that takes place in mid-November to mid-December. Then they come back after a little bit of a break for an academic block in January to April. And then they go into their second fieldwork placement in May-June, which is Intermediate 1. So these are the first-year students that are coming to see you in May. When they're done, after they're finished their placement with you, they'll have a bit of a summer holiday. They'll come back in year 2. They'll have a whole academic block, a bit of a break. They'll go into Intermediate 2 field work in January, February of next year, come back for some more academic work, and then they'll end with their final 4th transition to practice placement next summer. So that's a bit of an overview of how fieldwork works in our program. What I'd like you to see from this slide in particular is an understanding about how our students develop across the 4 fieldwork placements in terms of their professional development. So as an entry-level student, this exposure stage is really the basic level 1 placement. So that was the student's placement last November, December. Then we have this long acquisition stage here, which really comprises level 2 fieldwork, our Intermediate 1 and our Intermediate 2 fieldwork placements. And then at the end, we have integration, which represents the student's final transition to practice placement. So this stage here in the acquisition phase is really where students have a lot of opportunity to practice and hone those skills, to begin to consolidate their professional reasoning and get ready to move into that integration phase. It encompasses intermediate 1 and intermediate 2, both of which are considered to be level 2 placements. Here's another way, again, of looking at these stages. What I really want to draw your attention to here too is the levels of fieldwork. So basic fieldwork coincides with level 1. Intermediate 1 and 2 fieldwork coincide with level 2, and advanced fieldwork coincides with level 3. The reason these levels are important, and then I want you to really pay attention to them, is that these levels coincide with the competency-based fieldwork evaluation, with level 2 being intermediate 1 and 2 fieldwork. And so we recognize with your intermediate 1 students coming, that we want to sort of make it clear for you where they're at in level 2. So we refer to our intermediate 1 as level 2A and our intermediate 2 as level 2B, both of them falling within that level 2 range. So that's a bit of a sense of the stages of fieldwork and where our students are at when they're coming to you. Your intermediate 1 students will be your level 2A students in intermediate 1 fieldwork. So that's a bit of an overview of how we're structured. Now, a little bit more about the CBFE. So the competency-based fieldwork evaluation was developed a number of years ago out of Western University in collaboration with their OT community. It is now used in all but one of the English-speaking OT programs in Canada, and it's also used internationally in Ireland, for example. It has been mapped successfully to both the profile of practice and the essential competencies, but it's not, as you can imagine, yet mapped to the new competencies for OTs in Canada. And I'll speak to that a little bit more later. It is a copyrighted evaluation. We've done some work with the publisher to make some modifications, but this does mean that because it's copyright, we have to follow specific guidelines in terms of how we share the evaluation with students and how we share it with you as educators. So what about the new competencies for OTs in Canada? What does this mean for the CBFE? So just want you to be aware that nationally, we are in the process of reviewing the CBFE and looking at how we can rejig and redevelop a new evaluation that will more closely align with the new competencies for OTs in Canada. I think we'll need especially to look at the competency for culture, equity, and justice. One thing that's really nice is that there's an agreement nationally right now to use one evaluation. So that will be helpful as we move towards developing this or redeveloping the CBFE. So please just stay tuned. We'll keep you involved as things evolve in terms of the new development of another evaluation. But right now we will keep on using the current CBFE, anticipate for a number of years yet. In terms of the evidence, when the CBFE was developed, it was both field and pilot tested and was shown to have really good face validity, and it was seen to accurately reflect student development. So following the rollout, there was a study presented at COT showing that the CBFE really did typically measure students being ready to transition to practice at the end of their final placement. It also said that the current requirement of a minimum of 1,000 hours really related well to students being ready to practice upon graduation. Here are a few resources if you want after today to look into. These were created by Western University and they look at the creation and the implementation of the CBFE. Just a word of caution that each program does apply the CBFE slightly differently. So if you're looking at external resources, it's important to know that there may be some differences with how we apply it here at U of M. In fact, there are some differences. There's slight differences across all the programs. A few notes about accessing the evaluation and expectations of you as educators. So just to highlight that it is a copyright form, students coming into the program all purchase a paper copy of the CBFE manual. And that allows us to provide an electronic copy to you as educators. So all of you should have received an electronic version of the CBFE when you got your site notifications and also in preparation for today's workshop. And that is what you'll primarily use, is the electronic version for the evaluation. We have purchased some CBFE booklets to share with sites. So I'm just going to hold this up in the camera there, you can see. If you would like to have a paper copy of the CBFE manual, please let us know and we will share, make a point of sharing that with you and emailing it to your site directly. Some sites just appreciate having that paper manual on hand. In terms of expectations, just to note that this is an evaluation that you complete at midterm and at final. Excuse me. Educators, as an educator, you're not expected to indicate if the placement's a pass or fail. That's a decision that the university ultimately makes, and I'll speak more to that in a little bit. Are there any questions so far? We're all okay so far? Okay. Please just speak up if you have questions as I move along. So moving on to the CBFE manual, I'm going to talk very briefly about the CBFE manual, and then we'll look at the evaluation in more detail. So for those of you who do have a copy or who eventually get a copy of the paper manual, it's actually not very big. It's the first section speaks to the development, the history, the evidence, and the scoring. And then there are 2 copies of the evaluation within the manual. The evaluation itself is made up of 7 competencies. For each competency, there is a page for the student to develop their personal learning objectives. And then there's an overall score, which is not really meant to be an average. More so, it's meant to provide you an opportunity to kind of synthesize where you see the student at in their development. So just to review, there are 7 competencies. For each competency, there's also an opportunity for the student to develop their own personal learning objectives. Sometimes we refer to that as their learning contract or their learning plan. The CBFE is completed by you as the educator, as well as the student at midterm and final. Just for you to know, the students also have their own copy of the CBFE, the student version, so that they complete their own self-evaluation. Their version is the exact same as the educator's version, the only difference being that they have a learning log that's appended to the end of their evaluation that allows them to track some of their learning experiences along the way. At the beginning of the form, we have some demographic information that's very similar to the old form. So what does the CBFE measure? What are the competencies? So the CBFE, as you can tell by the name, really focuses on competencies rather than skills. And these are the 7 competencies outlined on this slide that are encompassed in the CBFE. The first one being practice knowledge, which, as you can imagine, really relates to our own OT discipline specific theory and knowledge. The second competency being clinical reasoning. The third one being facilitating change within a practice process. This competency really relates to all the elements of the OT process in terms of establishing therapeutic relationships, assessment, intervention, planning, and follow-up. The fourth competency, professional interactions and responsibility, really relates to the student's ability to develop relationships with clients, with colleagues, and also uphold legal and ethical standards. Communication speaks to one of our core OT competencies, both in terms of verbal and nonverbal communication. Number 6, professional development, captures students' self-directed learning and their accountability for their own professional development. And finally, competency number 7, performance management, really captures the student's ability with respect to time and resource management and developing their leadership skills. We do recognize that, as with any evaluation, there is some overlap. That's just how some evaluations seem to be. It's really hard, for example, to think about professional interactions without thinking about communication. So that's something we're aware of, and we do appreciate as you're filling out the evaluation. Excuse me. a bit of a tickle today. In terms of the structure of the evaluation, for each competency, so for each of those 7 competencies, there's 2 parts. There's a competency rating scale and there's a student learning objective rating scale. So what I'd like to do now is stop, and I'll stop sharing my screen here and walk you through the form and have a look at the evaluation so you can start to get a framework to sort of understand these different pieces. So I'm going to stop sharing my slide here and pull up the form. Now I need someone to tell me, can you see the CBFE form on the screen?
You bet.
Okay, excellent. How many of you have had a chance to look at the CBFE form yet? How many of you, is this your first time seeing it? Just even by a thumbs up. Okay. So for many of you, this is very well your first time sort of laying eyes on the electronic version of the CBFE. So I'm just going to walk you through it briefly, again, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So the first few pages are very much about the demographic information and provide you with a chance to sort of speak to the placement history. So those pages are a bit more self-explanatory and more similar to our old form. And then when you get to page 2, here's the placement history still. Page 2 is where you start to get into the competencies. So for each competency has 1 page that speaks to that competency. So here on the screen, you'll see the competency number 1, practice knowledge. And underneath this competency, you'll see bullet points, which is what we refer to as the competency descriptors. And that gives you some insight into that particular competency, as you'll see here. Then over to the right on the form, you'll see the stages or the levels of fieldwork and the scores that fall within those different levels. Below the scoring, you'll see the competency rating scale. So this rating scale really reflects students' development all the way from a rating of 1, which would be your entry-level student, all the way until number 8, entry-level clinician. So this is the rating scale that you will be using to rate your student at midterm and at final. So what will happen is at midterm, for example, you have a drop-down arrow here, which allows you to provide a rating. So if your student was on track in intermediate 1 in terms of meeting your expectations for where you want them to be at by the end, you would rate them at a 4. And then at final, when you went to rate them, again, if they were really progressing and they had got to the place where they were meeting your final expectations, where you wanted them to be at by the end of the placement, you would rate them at a 5. So you have an opportunity to provide that rating at midterm and at final. And then you also have the opportunity to provide comments at midterm and final. And those comments, similar to the old evaluation, are really about ways that the students are doing well and sort of giving examples of how they're demonstrating the competency, as well as what you see as opportunities for improvement and where you'd like to see the students continue to grow as they move throughout the placement or into their next fieldwork placement. So that is the competency page. Then for each competency page, there's also a learning objective page and a learning objective rating scale. So here we are still on that competency number 1, practice knowledge, and this is the learning objective page. Students in intermediate 1 will each develop a minimum of 1 personal learning objective for each competency. And they'll document that information about the learning objective on this page here. We'll talk more about the learning objectives, but this is just to give you a sense of what that learning objective entails. At the bottom of the learning objective page, you'll see a learning objective rating scale. that gives you an opportunity to review the students' progress on where they're at in terms of meeting their learning objectives at midterm and at final. You can see here I've used, I've made a mark here with the red line at midterm and a mark here with the green line at final to show where the students at on this scale in terms of their progress with their personal learning objectives. We will talk more in depth about learning objectives, but I just want to plant the seed that the learning objectives, the students' personal learning objectives, are not part of the pass-fail component of the evaluation. Their learning objectives are in fact something that if they don't meet that particular objective in the placement, they could in fact carry that over into another placement or future placements. So the personal learning objectives are not part of the overall pass-fail determination. Only the ratings on the competency rating scale are. So if we keep going throughout the evaluation, you'll see that it just repeats itself. So for competency number 2, clinical reasoning, you'll see the competency descriptors. You'll see the competency rating scale where you have the opportunity to make your ratings at midterm and at final. And make your comments. And then if you keep scrolling, you'll see the learning objective page for clinical reasoning. And that repeats itself for the whole CBFE. So we'll just scroll quickly through each one. So for each of the 7 competencies, you'll see the competency rating scale and the learning objective page with the learning objective rating scale. And that will take you all the way to the final page, which is the overall rating of student performance. So for this particular rating, it's not necessarily meant to be an average. It's an opportunity for you to sort of indicate where you feel the students at in their development along that continuum, again, from all the way from an entry-level student to an entry-level clinician being ready to transition to practice. There's again a space for comments, and also comments for in terms of future learning. And this is, students appreciate comments for each competency, but in particular, the directions for future learning is really helpful for future placements and also helpful just to think about transition to practice if it's in fact the student's last placement. That I will say too, that this overall rating, it is also not included in the overall determination of pass or fail. I'll speak to this more later, but it's essentially the final marks on the 7 competencies that determines the overall pass or fail. Excuse me. There's also a checkbox here to indicate if you feel the student should pass or fail the placement. This isn't something that we expect our educators to do. It's part of the form that we weren't in fact able to remove, but you are more than welcome to check off if you recommend that they do pass or fail. A word of caution while we're on it is the space, any space for signatures on the evaluation. You want to wait until you have completed everything. So not at midterm, but at final. Once you have completed the final evaluation and you don't anticipate any more edits, that's when you want to input your signature. What we have found for some sites and educators is that as soon as they input their signature, it locks the evaluation and you can't go back in to edit it, which is hugely problematic. So please hold off on your signatures until the very end and you are sure that you don't have any more editing to do. So before I head back to the slides, that's just a quick tour. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I don't see any. I'm going to carry on and get us back to the PowerPoint. No. Can I just ask what everyone sees now on their slide? What are you seeing, Georgia?
Expectations and competency rating scale slide.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Just want to see here. Just bear with me for a bit. Okay, that is good. That's where we want to be.
There's a question in the chat for someone that doesn't have a microphone.
Okay.
Do you want me just to read it for you?
Sure, that would be great. Thanks.
Is it only the students that make the learning objectives prior to placement, or do we do that together?
That's a great question, and we will talk about it more. In general, what happens with the learning objectives, the personal learning objectives, is that by the end of week 1, students are supposed to create one personal learning objective for each competency. And your role as the educator is really to just help the student determine if it's in fact realistic in your setting. But it's really up to them to do the work to create that personal learning objective. And I'll elaborate on it more as we go along. There's a section on learning objectives. They're meant to be augmentative or additive to your placement expectations as an educator, which is what I'll move into talking about now. So hopefully that answers your question for now. Okay. So that provides you with a bit of the history and the structure of the CBFE. I'm going to go into talking more about the expectations as an educator in relation to the competencies. So how do you go about setting your placement expectations when it comes to reading your student at midterm and final? What are you measuring against? So when it comes to the CBFE and your evaluation, it's really based on the placement expectations that you're setting as an educator. And there's a number of things that you're going to pull together to allow you to set your placement expectations and to evaluate your student. The first being those competency descriptors that you'll see on each competency page that gives you a sense of what fits within each competency. The second key piece to help you develop your expectations are the learning outcomes for the placement level. So every fieldwork course has learning outcomes for the placement level. So for this upcoming Intermediate 1 placement, you should have received a course description, and on that description, it has the key learning outcomes for the placement. What we've done is we've taken it a step further and we've created a mapping worksheet for you. And on the mapping worksheet, it has a column that lists the competency descriptors, and then it links the learning outcomes that relate to that particular competency. And then in the next column, it gives you some examples of what might be some sample expectations in Intermediate 1 related to that competency. Then your job as an educator, there's a blank column there in this worksheet, is to start to think about in your practice environment, what expectations fit for each competency. And that's what's going to help give you a sense of what you're evaluating your student against at midterm and final. So those placement expectations that you set for each competency, they give a roadmap for the student to know where you want them to be at by final. And it also gives you a roadmap and a structure for how you're evaluating your student at midterm and at final. It's important to keep in mind that you're the expert. So I really do see you as the expert. You have the knowledge of your placement and you know what opportunities are available, what your student's going to be able to practice, and what you're going to be able to evaluate your student on. So as you're thinking about developing your placement expectations, you're really thinking about what is it in your environment that your students will have that opportunity to practice, and what skills will they have to develop. You're also, again, thinking about those learning outcomes for each course, and you're thinking about the competency descriptors, those little bullet points under each competency in the CBFE. This slide, again, just speaks to those placement expectations, more so in terms of what will you use, again, as a review to help you develop your placement expectations. A helpful starting point is, what are those learning opportunities that are in your environment that the student will have a chance to participate in and begin to demonstrate those competencies? I really want to emphasize that you're setting minimum expectations for where you expect your student to be at by the end of the placement. So what do you minimally expect for a student to be rated at a 5, which would be the maximum for intermediate 1, by the end of the placement? What does your student need to be able to show or do on a regular basis for you to say, yes, they've achieved your expectations at this level and they're ready to move on to intermediate 2, level 2B. So having those expectations is really important to know what you're rating your student against, and for them to know as well, if they have that clear roadmap. Just to review, when it does come time for midterm and final, you're going to rate your student based on your expectations, and you'll place that rating on the competency rating scale on each page. I'll show you an example here. Whoa, sorry about that, Mike. I went a little wild with my clicking. So this is an example. It's a paper copy. It's taken from a basic student where the maximum is a 3, but you can see at midterm, the student received a 2, and then at final, they received a 3, which would be the maximum for level 1 basic. And the educator inputted the comments for both midterm and final. So whereas for intermediate 1, which would be the placement upcoming for all of you, typically 5 is mastery of intermediate 1. And that reflects that the student's ready to transition to intermediate 2. So if your student's performing well at midterm and they're doing what you would expect of them and they're on track for meeting the final placement expectations, then you would rate them at a 4. And if at final, they've satisfied all of your expectations and they're really ready to move on to an intermediate 2 placement, their next placement, then you would rate them at a 5. Excuse me. So what do we expect on the rating scale? I'm going to speak a bit more about our levels of expectations on the rating scale. So if we look at level 1, which is basic, typically 3 indicates mastery of that level and that the student's ready to transition to level 2. Level 2 encompasses both intermediate 1 and intermediate 2. So 6 ultimately is mastery of level 2 and means that students are ready to transition to level 3, which is their final advanced transition to practice placement. But more specifically, if we look at those 2 intermediate placements within level 2, for intermediate 1, we see the maximum being a 5. So for your students in intermediate 1, we don't want you to rate them higher than a 5. 5 means that they're clearly meeting intermediate 1 level 2A expectations, and they're ready to transition to intermediate 2 level 2B. Then once students transition out of intermediate 2 and into advanced, we see 8 as typically being that rating that reflects that the student's ready to transition to practice, sort of that entry-level clinician phase. So in terms of that evaluation, you're going to rate each competency on that scale, both at midterm and at final. The university will determine the pass or fail based on where the students fall on that scale and what the average of those ratings are. It's a reminder that it's based on the competency marks at final. So the final grading of the CBFE is essentially an average of those 7 competency marks at final. The midterm marks are still really important because they indicate how on track the student is in terms of meeting final expectations. It can also be a time where concerns are raised. So say, for example, if you have a student at midterm where you have some concerns and you're not sort of feeling confident that they're on track, providing a rating of a 3 or less would indicate that you have a concern with where they're at, and that would be important to be in touch with me. Anytime you have a concern or a question, it would really just be important to be in touch with me or anyone from our fieldwork team. This slide just provides another way of looking at the overall grading for all the placements. Let's take a closer look at intermediate 1, which is our focus for today. So here on this slide is a description of the competency ratings at final. So at the end of a placement, well, if a student was scoring a U, unacceptable, there would be serious concerns related to professionalism and safety, and that would have been addressed much earlier on. But at final, if a student is rated a 3, that's reflecting that they are experiencing some difficulties meeting intermediate 1 placement expectations. If at final they score, you rate them at a 4, that is reflective of their performance nearly meeting intermediate 1 placement expectations. If you rate your student at a 5, that says, yes, they're solidly meeting the expectations you have for an intermediate 1 level placement. So they've really got to where you want them to be by the end. And just keeping in mind that the maximum is a 5 for intermediate 1. So when the evaluations come back, I look at the grades, I'll look at the average of the 7 competencies. Remember, it does not include that overall rating. If the average is a 4 or above, the student will probably pass. If it's between 3.6 and 3.99, the student would be flagged for review. And lower than that, 3.59 or lower, the student would probably fail. I say probably in terms of 4 above, the student would probably pass, because there are some situations where the rating might look okay, but the comments just really aren't reflective of the student meeting the competencies. Anytime a student's flagged for review, I no longer am the one to assign the pass or fail. In those situations, I'd be in touch with you as the educator, I'd be in touch with the student, and I would bring all the information forward to the progress committee, and the decision regarding a pass or fail would go to the progress committee at that time. I'm giving this information so that you have a sense of the grading, but we don't expect you to use this information to make sure the student passes or fails. If there were concerns or you had any questions about grading, I would really just want you to reach out to me so we could have that conversation sooner than later. So that covers the competencies and expectations really briefly. I'm going to move into talking about the student learning objectives. But before I do, I'm wondering, are there any questions? I don't see any from my angle.
There was another one in the chat. I guess I'm the chat monitor for you.
Okay,
it's just asking about people that are like better than meeting expectations, the exemplary person who is like blowing your mind. Why can't you give them a 6? Because it's still in that too.
Right, exactly. So for that case, and we have had that question before, so I appreciate the question. What I would suggest doing in those cases is you want to have a way of letting the student know that. And so you can reflect that in the comments. You could say, in your, from your perspective, you would rate this, you're rating this student as exceptional, and you can make that note in the comments. And then I see that, the student sees that, and it's appreciated that way. Are there any other questions? Okay. I'm going to move on to learning objectives then. So student learning objectives, again, as the name implies, if this is really about student learning, it's all about student learning, but these objectives are much more under control for the student. So in the first week of the placement at intermediate 1 level, students are asked to develop a minimum of 1 learning objective for each competency. We hope that it will be additional or augmentative to the placement expectations that you're setting as an educator. They're identified by the student as an area that they want to focus on. Again, it could be something that they carry throughout in different ways throughout all of their placement settings. We want it to be developed by the end of the first week, and we give that first week to allow the students a chance to see and experience the placement and really understand what opportunities are available so they can actually go ahead and make those objectives. Your job as an educator is really just to ensure that the learning objectives are very much realistic and doable in your setting. But other than that, you don't have a lot of involvement in the student setting their personal learning objectives. Again, they're very much areas that the student wants to focus on that are related to the placement. You rate the students' learning objectives at midterm and final, but on that learning objective rating scale, again, it's important to note that that doesn't inform the overall decision of pass or fail. Just to review, at intermediate 1, students will develop a minimum of 1 personal learning objective for each competency. You'll rate them on that rating scale. One thing to keep in mind with the learning objectives in order to facilitate your evaluation and ability to mark on that scale is that you want to work with the student to figure out a way to have them copy their learning objective information into your version of the evaluation. So oftentimes students will just type it into the educator's evaluation, or you may be able to copy and paste their work into your evaluation, all with the goal of making it easy for you to evaluate, so that when you go at midterm to sort of put that rating on the learning objective rating scale, you can look above and see what your student's personal learning objective was for that competency. Oh, I am touchy today with my mouse. This slide just provides an overall review. Again, the rating is not numerical. It does not determine pass or fail. Students can carry over their learning objectives, their personal learning objectives, into other placements. When they're developing their learning objective, similar to any goal or objective we have students develop, we want them to be really clear about what they want to learn, be as objective as possible. We want you as the educator to think about, what is realistic and doable, and let them know if it's not. There's a spot for the student to fill out what resources they think will be required to help them meet this objective, as well as a column to indicate the evidence, so the proof of how their learning objective is met. And then another column for validation, which is really who, how, and when they want their objective to be validated. So say, for example, and oftentimes students will select feedback from their educator as one way that they'll have their learning objective evaluated or validated. This page just provides an overview again of that learning objective page and the information that the student's going to fill out in each column, the objective, the resources that are required to meet that objective, the evidence, so how they will, what proof will they show that they've met it, and how they want it validated, and then the learning objective rating scale that you'll complete at midterm and final. So that covers learning objectives in a nutshell. So we've really covered the key components of the CBFE, the 7 competencies, and then for each competency, there is the competency rating scale with comments, and the numerical rating, and the learning objective page, and the learning objective rating scale. And all of that is evaluated at midterm and at final. It's really those final marks on the competencies, those 7 competencies, that inform the overall decision or determination of a pass or fail. So that is a brief overview of all the pieces of the CBFE. Now that we know all of this, what is the process of evaluation? So I'll just speak briefly to the process. So it's similar to with the old evaluation. Essentially, both at midterm and final, you'll have an opportunity, you'll arrange some time to sit down with your student and go over the midterm evaluation. Similarly, at final, you'll do the same thing. This slide just speaks to expectations for the students. So what do we expect students to do? So we know that in that first week, by the end of week 1, we want them to develop their personal learning objectives and share that with you. At midterm and at final, the students are responsible for doing their own self-evaluation and sharing that with you. So that includes their rating, their own self-rating on the competency rating scale for each competency, as well as their learning objective rating scale for each of their learning objectives. They complete that, they share that with you as part of your evaluation. Sometimes it can be helpful to actually have the student share their self-evaluation with you even before you have your midterm or final meeting, just to give you a chance to digest it And you could do the same with the student. You could share your evaluation with them beforehand. The other thing that students are responsible to share with you at midterm is the fieldwork experience evaluation form. So this is a form that they complete at midterm and at final, and they share with you. And it provides a tool for them to sort of talk through their experience of how the orientation was and feedback and things like that. So that's the students' expectations. And then just to review the process for your expectations as an educator is you want to make sure that within that first week, you've been able to kind of sit down and talk to the student about what are your minimum expectations for them. What do you minimally expect for them to be able to do by the end of the placement relative to each competency? You'll collaborate with them when they develop their own personal learning objectives, mostly just to sort of help them decide if it's realistic and doable in their setting. And then both at midterm and at final, you'll provide the evaluation, the grade and the comments for each competency, and then the rating for each of the learning objectives. Sounds like a lot. Once you get into it, it usually doesn't feel like quite so much. But I know when I say it out loud, it does sound like a lot. You're not expected as an educator to indicate if the placement's a pass or fail, but you are welcome to click that box if you wish. At midterm, we don't require any of the forms, but we do at the very end ask that you email all 3 forms to OT Fieldwork. So we ask that you email your version of the CBFE, the educator's version, the student self-evaluation, so their version of the CBFE, as well as their fieldwork experience evaluation form. So all 3 of those forms get emailed to OT Fieldwork by you, and then we ask that you copy in the students or student so that they can see that that's been done, and then they also have a copy for themselves. I would say the other expectation that's not on this slide, but is just understood, is that, you know, along the way, you'll be receiving lots of emails and tips from us. And lots of times you won't have a chance to open them up because you'll be so busy, but you can file them away and refer to them for later. If at any point you have a question or a concern, just to not hesitate to reach out to us. Our goal really is when there's an educator in the field with a student and you have a question or concern, we usually, we strive to aim to get back to you as soon as possible that day. So we want and encourage you to reach out to us with any questions or concerns, especially if you're not quite sure if your student's meeting expectations. This is just a final comment just about the fact that it is a copyright form. At the end of the placement, because it's copyright, but also because it's students' confidential information, once we have received all the forms and Rhonda's gone through and made sure it's all clear and enterable, then we ask you to delete that copy because, again, it's students' confidential information. If you, again, just to remind you, if you would like a copy of that CBFE manual, the paper copy, we're happy to send it out to you if you let us know. Just to wrap up, this particular slide speaks to tricks and tips. The CBFE, not as much now, but when we first rolled it out in 2019, the form was a little fickle. So I just encourage you to read through some of these tips and tricks. I'll point out a couple of them. It typically is much more, the form is happy when you actually save it into a separate folder and use the save as feature every time you edit. You want to make sure that if you are ever fighting with the form, if for whatever reason it's not working with your software or your computer, there is always the alternative to do a paper copy. Your student, because they've purchased the manual, they have the option of printing out a copy for you, which you could scan, email back to us. We don't want you to fight with the form more than is necessary. We realize you're already putting a lot of work and effort into the placement. So please don't fight with the form. Check with us to help troubleshoot any issues. One issue we have noticed is that for educators who use a Mac, when you open it up in preview mode, sometimes the numbers look different. They often will look lower, and that gives everyone a scare. But when we open it up on our end in Adobe Reader, it tends to show the correct score. So you can always check with us if you're concerned about the score. Yeah, and just in general, we encourage you to keep in touch with us if you have any concerns and need some help troubleshooting.